All right, my name is Rich Schmidt. We're here with Matt Perry. It's March 16th, 2023. We're at the Nicholson Library at Linfield University. Matt, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
The first question, get things started. Why wine?
Why wine? I guess that kind of boils down to, when I was still in college, pursuing, kind of fermentation stuff. I was brewing beer at home, and I realized that brewing beer is a lot of the same over and over, a lot of cleaning, even more cleaning than winemaking somehow. And I also found out that the brewery industry is really competitive. I was looking for brewery jobs back in Minnesota to try and get my foot in the door to do anything, and it was basically like, you can come here and volunteer. And so the idea of getting paid as a poor college student was really motivating me to do a harvest in the wine industry. And I've always, liked, I've always been more of like a scientific kind of, I don't know if that's right brain or left brain, but the sciencey one. Been more that kind of a person. So I think wine is really interesting because it's kind of rooted in all of those, scientific backgrounds. And I was fortunate to have a lot of chemistry and microbiology, stuff like that. But I think there's, that constant unknown of things that just can't be explained by numbers or analysis or anything like that. And I think to me that's really the most kind of inspiring thing about being a winemaker is that, you're always on this chase for this almost unobtainable goal. And I think it's kind of just endlessly fascinating and thought-provoking.
So let's talk about life before wine a little bit. Tell us about where you're born and raised, where you grew up, and life before wine. Yeah,
so I grew up in Minnesota, up in the North Burbs. Have two parents and one little brother, and pretty normal childhood, I think. Lots of riding bikes around, playing home run derby in the street. And kind of always was interested in the outdoors, had a big kind of growing up through like Boy Scouts and did a lot of camping and backpacking. And that is, being out in the vineyard is always something that I've really liked about my job. I don't like having a 9-to-5 office job. So growing up there, really kind of, my parents weren't into wine. They were into food, I guess in the same way that most 90s people are. I guess, watching Emerald, was a big culinary highlight of my childhood. But, they did a lot, taking us to nice restaurants. And it was always, my grandmas were also, both really good cooks. So it was always a highlight when Grandma came to stay while my parents were on vacation because we'd eat really good food. And from there, I think, the wine thing didn't really start until kind of later in college. I had graduated high school, gone up to Vancouver, BC to do school up there. My dad was a pharmacist and I'd been working in pharmacy, so I was kind of on the pre-med pharmacy track. And UBC wouldn't let me into pharmacy school unless I applied for a green card and moved to Canada, which I didn't really want to do at the time. I mean, it wouldn't have been bad, but it wasn't my end-all, be-all. So after a couple of years, I transferred back to the University of Minnesota and, continued working in pharmacies and going through, anatomy class and some real dull stuff. And I kind of realized that I didn't really want to follow that path anymore. And kind of as I alluded to earlier, somehow, I don't know if it's because I was 20 and, couldn't buy beer, but I was brewing my own beer. Really interested in that kind of fermentation science. I was really fortunate that the University of Minnesota has a good program. They've developed a lot of apples and grapes and blueberries and kind of have a niche in the cold, hardy viticulture sphere. So there was a research laboratory there, research vineyard. So I kind of decided that I was going to add another year, pursue the wine thing, and so did like a minor in horticulture, and then kind of steered my chemistry degree more towards analytical chemistry than like medical studies. So I got really lucky that most everything I was doing was pretty applicable. You know, I wasn't a philosophy major that decided last minute I wanted to make wine. And, you know, got really lucky with the team at the Horticultural Research Center there. John and Jenny, hello, thank you. Nick Smith, hello, thank you. But you know, basically got plopped in and really got my feet wet in, you know, probably up to the shins, really. And that was, you know, the only way that I could really make it work in Napa. If I wouldn't have had that kind of strong lab background, I don't know if I would have ever gotten a job in Napa. So yeah, did that and graduated in July. I was a summer grad of university, which is, you know, a little melancholy. Don't get to walk with everyone else, but you know, most of the classes that I needed to finish up had little to nothing to do with winemaking. So in a way, I was kind of ready to just take my finals. And the week after I was done with school, I moved out to Napa for my first harvest out there. And that was, you know, almost night and day, going from a tiny little research winery where we're making, you know, a gallon, maybe 5 gallons at the most of wine, out to Napa where we're making hundreds and, you know, thousands of tons of grapes. It was really, really kind of special, the first harvest, I think. I was at Stag's Leap Wine Cellars, which, you know, won the whole Judgment of Paris, and it was a really cool place to start making wine and to, you know, experience all those things for the first time. You know, a lot of the interns that I worked with, I'm still really good friends with. The winemakers there, still keep in touch with somewhat. But it was just really cool to go from, you know, almost nothing to one of the most historic wineries in the Napa Valley.
So before we get to Napa, I'm curious about your first experiences in that kind of research. Obviously, Minnesota, not really a big wine region or known for being a wine region. Tell me what the research vineyard viticulture work was like, and what appealed to you enough to want to go on and take the next step.
Yeah, so I actually worked at 2 different wineries in Minnesota. I did, you know, even though I got into winemaking because of money, my first job in a commercial winery was definitely an unpaid position. So it was actually in this guy's garage. He had split the garage in 2, and so half he ran his at-home accounting business out of, and then the other half he ran a small commercial winery out of. And we made grape wine, we made raspberry wine, we made blueberry wine. And the weirdest thing about this wine, I'll never forget, it didn't have any running water in it. So if I had to clean anything, I had to take whatever I needed to clean out behind the garage and spray it out with the garden hose. So I learned how important sanitation was at that job. And, you know, the HRC was really interesting. I hopped on. I didn't do harvest at the HRC, so when I got there, everything was pretty much all wine, or, you know, nearly wine, still fermenting. And, you know, all of that kind of lab work is used for research papers. So, you know, everything was done in triplicate. You know, really good compared to, you know, most winery labs, you know, extremely high level of standardization and control, and, you know, external cross checks with other labs. But a lot of that was just kind of, you know, analysis for the next wave of grape varietals that they were about to release. So I got to work on the Marquette grape, which was exciting. There's kind of a first generation of grapes, and the red one called Frontenac is so obscenely dark that it will actually stain stainless steel. So they were kind of looking for something that, was a little more commercially viable, which is, at that point, it's kind of weird tasting wine that no one else has tasted. You can count the number of people on one hand that have, put those grapes or that wine in their mouth. And the same thing with, the apple breeding. That was one of my favorite parts of working there, was pretty much every week, they'd come in with a new bushel of some apples that they had bred, and, they asked us to rate how good it was, how the texture was, how sweet it was. So it was awesome, just free apples all week long. And so the HRC, was just a lot of, routine analysis as far as, keeping the wines in check. But then a lot of it was also just kind of seeing what really conformed to standard kind of winemaking analysis. Obviously, when you're breeding grapes for cold hardiness, they use a lot of riparian background. So things that, are either way too acidic or, don't ripen properly. So, I mean, there was some wines, I feel like some wines, had a pH of 2.6 and, 20 grams per liter of acid, and just shocking numbers. So we didn't taste all of them. I think that would probably strip some enamel off your teeth pretty quick. But no, it was a good team, and really thankful to learn a lot of just basic lab winery skills. Running specs, running titrators, running pH meters, and I think the other thing that I was really happy about was that it was done at such a high level. It explained to me at such a high level, at least the lab work was, that it kind of really reinforced that throughout my career, that if you're doing lab work, it's not just you're not just trying to get a number, you're trying to get the right number, or as close to the right number as you can. So I think it was a really good foundation for me to build on.
And what year did you graduate from college?
Oh, good question. 2010.
Why Napa?
Napa had the most jobs available. And 2010 was a hard time to get into the wine industry. I didn't really know this as a 23-year-old, but the global financial crisis really did a number on the wine world. And I mean, that first year, I probably applied for 150, 200 jobs in Napa. I think I had 5 interviews. So I took the job that was given to me. And it was funny, I moved up here later, but kind of after I had settled up here, there's a couple people, I did apply for some jobs in Oregon. I wasn't very picky about, where I wanted to work. I just wanted to work somewhere. But, did connect with some people up here in Oregon and said, oh yeah, I interviewed for a job with you back in 2010. And Napa, I think at that time just, it was the place to make wine in America. I think if you're going to start out, and certainly, 2010, Oregon was still, somewhat unknown. I have a good friend that we took a road trip up here after harvest was done in 2010 and came to McMinnville, stayed at McMinimans, and after coming from Napa, I was just kind of like, oh, is this it? Is this all of wine country in Oregon? And it was. So, it was a good place to start, and I think Napa's also nice because, the harvest is longer, the wineries are bigger. I think you just get a lot more repetitions doing things and a lot more practice, a lot more time to learn. I don't think the winemaking community is quite as giving down in Napa than it is up here, but certainly making a couple thousand tons of grapes versus a couple hundred, you get a lot more practice in. And just kind of the complexity of cellar work down there is, I think it's a good foundation to build on. Learning how to multitask and run multiple pumps at the same time, and I think it's it's a nice place to learn. But I'm glad I ended up here.
So you had mentioned obviously that big leap into the first harvest, first harvest there.
Yes, the stag's leap.
Stag's leap. It's a big leap into stag is a big thing, exactly. So tell me about that experience for you. What did you enjoy about it? What was surprising to you, and what kind of helped you determine that was the right path for you?
Yeah. So the first harvest at Stag's Leap, I was in the lab and couldn't get out of the lab fast enough. I was a little fortunate that it was not a great harvest, so a lot of sorting necessary, a lot of labor necessary. So I kind of weaseled my way out of the lab maybe once or twice a week to go work in the cellar. And I think at that time, what was really kind of not lost on me, but was more surprising was that, you're working in a lab not retroactively looking at things during harvest, but like you're kind of the pinch point. And so, you're running analysis, and the winemaker is waiting for you to make a decision about pressing or about some addition that they need to make. So I think that was the biggest shock. I was used to kind of lab work at set this up and then go have a break and then, do some analysis and then, lunch. And it was a much different pace. Fortunately, that first harvest in Napa, I think it was pretty reasonable, the hours, but it was such a long harvest. I think we started in August, training and sampling, and, we didn't finish until practically Christmas. So it went by very fast. But the first harvest, I think, is you kind of are going through it and you're like, well, I'm not, don't think you're learning as much on a day-to-day basis. And then, at the end of it, all of a sudden you just realize that you just have soaked up so much knowledge just, on a everyday, learning something new, seeing something new. And yeah, it's a really interesting winery to work at.
So after that harvest, then what were you sort of hoping your career would be, and what was your next step?
I definitely wanted to learn how to make wine in the cellar. That was, my primary goal at that point. I still, I came back to Minnesota, or went back to Minnesota and worked in wine shops, and I was a downhill ski racing coach. So my little brother was on the ski team, so I had to go back and coach him, and so I did that, through the spring, summer, winter, spring, summer, I guess, and then went back to Napa for 2011 and 2012 harvest. And from there, I really kind of wanted to branch out and work at different kinds of wineries. So the winery I worked at in 2011 was called Robert Sinsky Vineyards, and they, did a lot more organic biodynamic winemaking, and couldn't have been a starker, difference than working at Stag's Leap. It was really kind of enlightening, how little they did to the wine. I just remember at Stag's Leap, every day of white pressing, at the end of the day, I'd weigh out chemicals to, add to tanks, and just that was kind of just the normal winemaking procedure. And, I didn't realize until I got to Robert Sinsky that we haven't added anything to these grapes. We just moved the grapes from there to there and moved the juice from there to there. And so that was really kind of enlightening to me. And I'm glad it was, my second harvest, because I think if you were to just show up, it's your first harvest, you would almost take for granted, how limited the winemaking kind of technique is. Not technique, but manipulation, chemical manipulation, whatever you care to call it. And, Robert Sinsky was great. It was a lot of fun. It was the first time I had made Pinot. Really enjoyed that. and got to make a lot of Alsatian white wines, blends and single varietal stuff. Pinots, where I fell in love with Cab Franc. Still have some bottles from that winery, from that vintage, and obviously, Cabernet Merlot. But it was good. It was a small team, much different. There was two interns, a cellar master, and 2 winemakers, and for 600 tons. So, but it was a great kind of team building, bonding. Stag's Leap was a very corporate winery. Everyone clocks in, clocks out, goes home, and that's where I kind of had the first real camaraderie of harvest, and eating lunch together and having beers after work. Certainly where I learned a lot of cellar skills. There's really 2.5 of us, in the cellar, so it's a lot of barrels to fill for 2 people, and really just great wine, great kind of ethos for winemaking. We learned a lot.
What did you like most about the work?
That's a good question. I like the people I worked with a lot. Zach and Armando, the two kind of guys I worked both with, were very friendly and also, very giving in their knowledge. And also, supporting me in a way, I guess. I think, obviously when you're doing something for the first time, you're going to make some mistakes. And I think I took my mistakes hard, and they made sure to let me know that it was okay and that I would screw up less in the future. But the people there were great. The wine was great. I met my now wife there. We'd both worked there. She worked in the tasting room, and I worked in the cellar. So it'll always kind of be a special winery for us.
What about the next year?
The next year I went to St. Superi Vineyard. So, the thought being that I worked at a small place, organic, biodynamic, learned that side. And so I kind of wanted to work at a bigger winery, but also liked the kind of family-owned aspect. And honestly, I was also looking for some kind of full-time job. So I figure if I show up to a big winery, I might get lucky and they might, need someone after harvest. But St. Superi, it was one of the most technical wineries I've worked at. The winemaker, Michael, is Australian, and he was just on it. You have hundreds and hundreds of tanks, and nothing went past the guy. And that was, 2,000 tons of Sauv Blanc, probably another, they did some custom crushed Pinot, did a lot of Cabernet Bordeaux stuff. But, that was a lot of repetition. That was really great. And, we would have pump overs would be usually 2 people in the big cellar. So you'd have one person on top, one person on the bottom, and you'd be pumping over probably 5 or 6 tanks at a time. Using walkie-talkies is the most fun I've had in winemaking in a long time. And just really, executing at a high level. And I think, that vintage I just really learned how to hustle, I think is, the one thing I took away from that. And I think also, when you're working in a big winery, I think you have to be a little more thoughtful about the way you work, and pay more attention to how you set things up. And I think it gives a good mindset when you're having to be flexible and stay flexible. Whereas working at a smaller winery, if you're only doing one task, it's fairly straightforward. But to be able to kind of think and change plans on the go was really a good foundation to build on too.
So now you've done 3 harvests at 3 different places in Napa. What will you? And you said you're obviously looking for full-time work. So what's the next step for you at that point?
So the next step was I stayed on there after harvest through probably February. So at that point, my little brother had graduated high school, so I no longer went home to go coach ski racing. So at that point, I was eyes toward Australia, or honestly anywhere, Australia, New Zealand. And for some reason, whenever I try and break into something, I had the hardest time. So Australia, first harvest in Australia was a lot like first harvest in Napa, where, I don't know, I had worked 3 harvests and not a ton of experience, but same thing, man. I probably applied to 200-300 wineries in Australia and got really fortunate. There was I think, Decanter article that came out right as I was applying to all these places about Tasmania and about, cool climate, sparkling wine, and Pinot Noir. And I said, that sounds more interesting than, run-of-the-mill, big Shiraz, whatever else about Australia. So that was actually kind of where I focused my search, and was fortunate enough to end up at a winery called Bay of Fires, which has gone through a number of conglomerate owned, I don't even know who they're owned by right now, but they had probably the biggest sparkling program in Tasmania for a long time. So that was by far the most exciting part, and really high-end stuff. I mean, they would kind of leave things entourage for 6 to 10, 15 years, which, at that time was kind of almost unheard of in the New World, I mean. But, same kind of thing. It was, I think I was the last intern hired, so, really flew it under the radar. And it was a wild harvest in Tasmania. It was 13 in Tasmania was very similar to 13 in Oregon, where it just started raining right before harvest. And me coming from California, and it's sunny and nice the entirety of harvest, it's kind of, is this normal? Is this, or should we start picking grapes last week? But that was a bigger winery. I think we probably did, I don't know, 1,500 tons, something like that. About a third still, about a third white, about a third red, third sparkling, third still white, third still red. And that was also where I learned to hustle. Man, that was the first time I've ever worked at a winery that was a 24-hour continuously run winery. And for the sparkling wine, it was all, obviously picked and pressed in Tasmania, and they had a separate facility up on the mainland that we would bulk wine out to. So, running 3 presses constantly, 24 hours a day. In that harvest, like I said, the weather was pretty brutal, so it was just a slog fest to pick as many grapes as possible and get them turned into juice as fast as possible. So there'd be days where you'd leave it was the 7th to 7th, so you'd leave at 7 o'clock, and you unloaded some grapes and put them over there and hand off your work, and then you get there at 7 a.m. the next day, and those grapes are still sitting there, and it's like, oh, okay, well, we'll try and get to them today now. But it just, I remember, pressing grapes and loading at a tanker at the same time. So you're just, pumping in and pumping out and really just trying to get it all done. But fortunately, the wines we made in that vintage were really excellent. I've had the opportunity to go back and taste them and have some brought over from friends, and that was, I think, really where I fell in love with. I mean, sparkling wine's a lot of fun, but where I fell in love with, Chardonnay in general. I'd never really come across much compelling Chardonnay in Napa, and honestly didn't pay much attention to it, but I think that was really where it started to click for me, that cool climate Chardonnay and cool climate Pinot too were something that I wanted to pursue more. So my wife came with me, and so we were there from March until probably July. And at that point, I think we were over Napa. We realized that, we were never going to be able to buy a house there, honestly, the job market wasn't looking any better, and, we just kind of wanted something different. So we came up to Oregon, and at that point I hadn't had much Oregon wine. I was working at one wine shop, and we had a bottle of Antica Terra that I was persuaded to buy by one of my coworkers, and I had that, and I said, okay, I think there's something here. So came up here in 2013 to work at Antica Terra with Maggie, and that was really what kind of cemented my love for Oregon. Really thoughtful way of not only making wine but doing everything, and something that I hadn't really been exposed to before. She's incredibly generous with her knowledge and sharing lovely wines from all over the world that inspire her, and and she, I think, wants to inspire other people, and I was definitely inspired by everything that happened with her. And yeah, 2013 in Oregon, I didn't think it could be worse than 2013 in Tasmania, but it really was just a slogfest as well. I think I got here probably the first or second week of September. We started work, cleaning everything up, and then all of a sudden it just rained 6 inches in one day, and I'm just kind of like, this doesn't seem like it's a good thing. We haven't picked any grapes, and it's a lot of rain. And oh boy, that harvest, I was really lucky that we had probably the best crew of people that I've ever worked with. All, really hardworking people, really fun to be around. But there was a lot of long hours. I mean, there was just sorting grapes after sorting grapes, for a long time, much longer than any sane person would want to do it. But, everyone there, I think, kept a really good spirit, worked at a really high level, and we still managed to have fun with, one of the worst harvests that you could probably ask for in the last decade. But from there, I think I realized that I wanted to stay in Oregon. I really liked this community, the fact that people here were willing to share ideas and share wines, and I mean honestly their time. In Napa, I think the first Stag's Leap Winery, I don't know if we ever had a bottle of wine at work, and certainly at the last couple wineries I worked at, there was a lot more camaraderie, but you never just sat down with a winemaker and talked about this wine or that wine, and certainly not, the great wines of the world. So that was a really kind of transformative experience. And, also I think you walk into Antica Terra and you just kind of look around and you wonder where the winery part of the winery is. And there's more people than there are tanks or pumps or any kind of normal winemaking equipment. And it really kind of showed me that if you have the best grapes, you really don't need a lot. You need people that are there paying attention, doing everything they can to make it into delicious wine. But you don't need shiny tanks or fancy equipment, and I think that was kind of a big takeaway after working in these giant stainless steel, everywhere wineries, that at the basics, it still can work out really, really well.
So obviously, having been to Antica Terra Winery, I can picture exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Tell me about that experience for you after having worked at so many large places and with so much equipment and so much everything. What were your impressions of sort of making wine that way, and what what was it that made you think that Oregon was the place you wanted to stay?
I think, in terms of the winery and the winemaking, it was the first winery that I ever really felt like, that like this is home. Like I could just see myself being here, staying here. I loved the work. I think was very thought-provoking, kind of a never compromise mentality. And I think it was, a lot different than everything I had done in Napa. In some ways, kind of comparable to Robert Sinski in terms of the wine and winemaking and style. But then, I honestly think that it was just having the opportunity to kind of interact with Maggie, on a daily basis of, okay, gang, here's what we're going to do today, and having lunch and sharing wines. And, I think that was the biggest part for me, where I just felt like the community was more embracing of young people that wanted to learn. And I was a young person that wanted to learn. That is for sure. So
what did you do after harvest?
After harvest with Maggie, I went back to Australia. So 2014, I went to Brokenwood Winery in the Hunter Valley, which was a lot of fun. Their company motto is make great wine and have fun, and both of those things were done in spades. It was different. It's a larger winery. They're probably 1,000 tons, maybe, somewhere around there. But one of the cool things about the winery is that, they pull in grapes from, obviously, the Hunter Valley, where they are. They have some very old vineyards, very nice vineyards, good grapes. But then they also kind of cherry pick from the rest of Australia. So we would get, either grape tankers. So we'd get, like, McLaren Shiraz. We'd get, Western Australia Cabernet, and then they had a smallish little vineyard, kind of in not the Yarra Valley, but in kind of Victoria area, and so they had like a grape quarantine there. So there was phylloxera in the region, and so you couldn't move any grapes in or out of that part of Victoria. So we would have to go down there and make that was all Chardonnay and Pinot. So we'd fly down there, get a fresh pair of boots, work for 3 weeks down there making the Chardonnay and Pinot, and then fly back to the home base, Brokenwood, which I think, to me, really, after working at Bay of Fire's Antica Terra, and then working with that vineyard and making that kind of Chardonnay, really kind of cemented my love for Chardonnay. Beechworth is the region that it came from, and there's a couple other wineries there. Giaconda is near there, but certainly not mainstream Australian winemaking region that you think of. But Brokenwood, the other thing that really stood out to me was kind of the level of mentorship offered. It was kind of the same thing I saw with Maggie, where everyone is happy to have a chat about why we're doing this, why we're doing that, how they've come to realize that's what they want to do, and maybe some of the trade-offs of doing that versus other things. But then they also, every week would have like a big dinner and invite other winemakers from other wineries nearby. And it'd be a themed dinner. So there'd be a Burgundy dinner, and there'd be a Bordeaux dinner, and just the sharing these wines that when you're a 25-year-old, however old I was, it's something that can't imagine of drinking some of those wines, and it was a very, very generous thing to do, and I think that really kind of led me down the path of like, I just want to make the best wine in the world. That's, the one goal I have is to really just get after it, put everything into it. And, I think that is a good kind of, like I said, maybe a little bit of a folly trying to obtain the unobtainable, but I think it's a fun path to be on.
It's a lot of harvest in a pretty short time. With the harvest hopping, I assume at some point you were ready to land somewhere.
Yeah, that was definitely high on the list. So that 2014 harvest, my wife actually got a full-time job here in Oregon. So I was strongly requested to make my way back to Oregon sooner rather than later. So no hanging out in Thailand for a month scuba diving or anything like that. So I got back here in June. Probably June. Luckily, Antica Terra had some work for me, kind of waxing bottles and doing, general labor, which I was very fortunate for because, living here without any kind of job was not a great opportunity. And so at that point, I was really just on the hunt for any kind of full-time work. So I was really lucky to land a job at the Carlton Winemakers studio back for the 2014 harvest. So I was the cellar master there dealing with, I think at that time it was probably 12 different winemakers, which was a challenge. It was, a lot of fixing things and not necessarily cleaning up after people, but I think it was good and it was fun. I learned a lot about kind of facilities management, which is just the most unglamorous but necessary part of winemaking. A lot of righty-tighty, lefty-loosey, but also just good troubleshooting and it's a good skill set to have. Both in work and personal life. So, there's a lot of winemakers there that are still there today that I respect a lot, and was fortunate enough to kind of not work for them, but I think some of those people realized that I wanted a little bit more, and so some of them offered some time to taste, and certainly I was doing some wine work for clients of the Winemakers studio, so it was a good way to kind of plant myself here. Nice place to land.
Obviously, not a very large space and a lot of personalities in a space like that. So tell me about managing a number of winemakers like that.
Oh, yeah. It's a great idea in theory, but man, in practice, it's hard. Everyone wants the same thing at the same time. And I think that was the hardest thing. It's just like you said, it's really just managing personalities and making people realize that everyone's literally wants the same thing at the same time, and we have to share and we have to wait our turn, and don't break things. And I think at that time there was a lot more winemakers and a lot kind of different style of winemakers. So I think it was a little bit harder at that point, but now it seems more manageable.
So how long were you at the Winemaker studio?
I was there for the 2014 harvest, so I was there about a year, probably from June to June or so. And then from there I got offered a job at Adelsheim Vineyard. So that was, I started in June 2015. And that was, really great. Kind of walked into a fortunate situation, where multiple people had left at the same time. So I thought I was kind of going in there for a lab cellar hand role, and ended up working that first 6 months, and then got made cellar master, right after that. But that was, a really great winery to plant your feet down and be there for a couple years, I was there until 2022. So was that 15? It's almost 7 years. Certainly the historic element of it is I'm kind of a romantic person at heart. So being able to sit in the same room with David Adelsheim or go to his vineyard and walk the original vines with him is something that was really cool. And by the time we had got to Napa, most of the kind of first generation, it was either had already passed away or was no longer involved. So that to me is something that is crazy special, even for me as someone experienced in the wine industry. But it was always really cool having interns come, and David was also very generous with his time, and he would always meet the fresh batch of interns. We'd go on a vineyard tour and say, oh, this is the quarter-mile vineyard, and then David would walk out on the deck and introduce himself to everyone and talk about planting the vineyard, whatever, 5 years ago, and the same kind of thing. I think that's just the consistent trend in Oregon, is that people are very generous with their time and very, very kind of endearing of the next generation of winemakers. I think at Adelsheim, I think it was a great fit for me, just because I think it's a really inquisitive bunch. Dave Page was still there when I started, and Gina Hennon, who's now the winemaker, was kind of the associate winemaker, and those two just loved asking each other questions and doing experiments that there's a lot of them, and I think just kind of getting that exposure to such a different array of winemaking and being in that kind of mindset of, well, what if we tweaked this or what if we tweaked that, I think to me really I was there for whatever 6 years, but it felt like a lot longer than that, just with kind of the diversity of things, the diversity of fruit, the diversity of winemaking, and so to me that was really exciting. And when I was there, I'd focused more on the white winemaking. I was very fortunate that the other person who left right as I joined the team had been really in charge of the white winemaking there, as far as harvests go. So I just kind of was very happy to step into that role. And looking back on it, it was a little crazy. Just I'd worked there June, July, August, and then all of a sudden harvest comes around, and it's here's a couple 100 tons of Pinot Gris, and the Chardonnay, I think at that time was a lot more minimal than it was at maybe 30 tons, something like that. But it was an interesting transition. In the 6 years that I was there, we went from making majority Pinot Gris white wine to really having a strong sparkling program, and grew a Chardonnay program from 20-30 tons to over 100 by the time I left, which is probably pretty emblematic of the valley at large. But the sparkling program was a lot of fun, working with all of our oldest, highest elevation vineyard, and it was great to be there for so long because sparkling wine takes a long time to learn. So by the time I was left in 2021, I think we were releasing the 2016 sparkling wine. So we really only finished I only saw two vintages from crush to eventual disgorging and release. So it was a fascinating thing to learn year over year, and that kind of the time frame for making sparkling wine is really hard. Glad I don't do it anymore, but I think just that kind of the eagerness of Adelsheim to always be improving and asking questions is something that really fit really well with my kind of personal goals.
So as you mentioned, the first place where you kind of planted your feet, tell me about your evolving role there. And as you were focusing more and more on white wines, what were some of the sort of skills or tricks you learned about white wine making specifically?
I think it was kind of one of those things where, once the Pinot Gris went away and it was really a focus on Chardonnay, I think that was really what piqued my interest the most. And there was just endless numbers of experiments and, different picking times and, different handling of the wines, reductively, oxidatively, and, different élevage procedures. I think, it was really an interesting thing I almost look at literally everything different you could do to Chardonnay. We went through a lot of different oak regimes, not regimes, but, tried a lot of different coopers, tasted a lot of different barrels. And, I think that was really, not a lot of places kind of give you that experience. The ability to kind of do that working with your own estate vineyards and, that's probably one of the top 20 biggest producers of Chardonnay, and you wouldn't really think it, but having the ability to work with that quality and quantity of grapes, and then also being able to work with Gina to design experiments for this vineyard or that vineyard, and I think it's really cool to be able to work with long-term sites and have the same grapes, same vineyards every year, and to really refine your goals kind of incrementally.
So as you look back on time at Adelsheim, obviously you mentioned the experiments, obviously something that they've always been known for. Do you have either sort of favorite experiments, meaningful moments that you look back on most fondly?
Yeah, there's a lot of them. We came out with 3 new wines over the 6 years that I was there. So, a lot of that was just because, Adelsheim was a Pinot Gris powerhouse for a long time. So, I think when I started, they only had Chardonnay planted at maybe 3 of their estate vineyards. And, the best stuff certainly went to the sparkling wine. So, when I first started there, we were buying a lot of grapes from Stoller, and that was kind of the single vineyard wine that they had made historically. And then there's a vineyard there called Ribbon Springs up on Ribbon Ridge that we grafted a lot of Pinot Gris over to Chardonnay and then planted more Chardonnay. And that was a really exciting site to work with. And so eventually, probably 2016, that became kind of the estate single vineyard wine, which was something that, really cool. It's grapes that had never existed before, and now they're going into a bottle of wine. And David Adelsheim was really big on his kind of staking claim and breaking ground series wines that, were kind of a Chehalem Mountains blend. So that was some purchased fruit, some estate fruit, but really tried to encapsulate all of the kind of soil series in the Chehalem Mountains. So that was a really fun wine to make, I think. And then there was one vineyard that always gave me the most trouble, was Boulder Bluff Vineyard, which is kind of an interesting, is 548 clone, which tends to be very phenolic and kind of tropical, and that was a vineyard that always gave me a lot of trouble, and I was questioning what to do. We definitely started making some strides. 17, 18, considerably better. 19 was really nice, and then 2020, it was probably that or 21 were the best vintage of that vineyard that we had made, and It was some of the only clean fruit that we picked before the fires in 2020. So that ended up being the 2020 single vineyard wine, which I should probably pull one of those out of the cellar and drink it and check in on that. But I think when you're making those minute adjustments and tweaks and you see them working and the wine quality improving, I think that's the most exciting thing.
Obviously, you mentioned 2020. I was going to ask about that next anyway. So let's talk about the 2020.
Oh, let's do it.
The everyone's favorite year. So obviously, multiple challenges that year, but with the harvest specifically, tell us about the challenge that gave you and how you handled it.
Yeah, what a bummer. I think dealing with COVID, whatever half the year before that, I think everyone was really looking forward to having something meaningful to do with their life. We were all ready to wear masks and sit apart from each other at lunch, and then that hit, and it was hard. Certainly there was a smaller fire that was probably a couple stone throws away from David Adelsheim's house. On top of everything COVID going on, we also had half of our vineyard crew evacuated from their house. We had friends that lived up there that were evacuated from their house, and they came to live with us for a week. And I just remember them coming into our house and be like, "Do you want us to wear a mask in your house?" I'm like, "I can only handle one catastrophe at a time. So right now it's forest fire, But as far as the winemaking goes, honestly, I felt worse for the interns. I think it was just such a bummer of a year. Had it happened at the end of harvest, and we got most of the grapes in, it would have been one story. But to kind of having to slog through it, knowing that this is not going to be great wine, I think was really, really hard. Some people, I think some of our interns saw that, and it was, I think, hard as a leader manager to not be bummed out, at least when you're facing your interns and talking to them. But some of the people still, I think, had a pretty good outlook on it, and still used it as an opportunity to learn. I certainly had plenty of time to teach people that were still interested in learning. So one of my Adelsheim interns in 2020 actually came and worked with me in 2022, and that was a really exciting kind of we missed on the first one and it wasn't meant to be, but there's more harvests out there in the future.
Coming off of that harvest in 2020 and that whole year in 2020, a lot of things kind of happening after that. So tell us what was next for you. What?
Yeah, I think 2020 was eye-opening in a lot of ways. I think for me that it was hard, with everything going on in the world, the country, to be in the luxury goods market is, I think pretty easy to forget at the end of the day. We're not necessarily providing any utility to civilization or the world. We are simply making delicious things to drink. At that point I had, been at Adelsheim for 6 years, and, I think kind of had learned a lot about, answered a lot of the questions that I had about winemaking, and, was not tapped out, but, I was ready for a new challenge. I think the other thing that's nice is that, you kind of learn where you want to go next. So I ended up accepting a job for the winemaker for 000 wines. And so it started in April of 22. I'm still there currently. Which to me, when I was looking for my next step after Adelsheim, I really thought back, to where I felt the most at home. And, to me that was at something like Antica Terra. And, I'd been familiar with the 0.0 wines and tasted them here and there. But, throughout the interview process was just really impressed. And, it's been a real joy to work with the Herman family, Chris and Catherine. The entire operation is very high level, from the vineyard sourcing to the winemaking. Everything is just really top notch. And it's awesome to, go into a day at work during harvest, and, you just have some of the best grapes that are grown in Oregon from some of the oldest vineyards, and it's really hard to not be happy making that kind of a wine. So, very exciting.
What's it like to be winemaker versus cellar master, assistant winemaker, intern, everything else you've been? What's it like to have that title?
Not as hard as I thought it would be. I think you develop that intuition, whether you're the one calling the shots or you're kind of second in charge. I think, even though you're not making those decisions, I think you form pretty strong opinions. And I'm personally, someone that has a hard time making decisions. So I do a lot of second guessing late at night. But I think once you realize that, it has to be done, in calling picks or picking barrels or, anything. You're not going to shoot 100%. But, just relying on your kind of accumulated wisdom to make the best decision in the moment in that situation is really kind of all you can ask of yourself.
You mentioned being impressed through the process of applying and interviewing at 0.0. What did you sort of take away from as like the goal and your role in their goal?
I think, the thing that really sold it for me is our vision aligns when, I think all of us want to make the best wine in the world. And they were very clear that, that's their goal, and I was very clear that's my goal. And I think that's why, that it ended up the way it did. So
you mentioned earlier, you talked about kind of initial impressions of Oregon as you got to Antica Terra and started working in some of the various places here, and talked about kind of the inclusivity and the welcoming aspect of it. What have you seen as far as Oregon's changes in that way, or what does Oregon look like to you now in 2023 as an industry?
I think it's really exciting. I think, when we got here in 2013, 2014, it was still, I don't want to say the old guard, but it still seemed that most of the wineries were, people that had 10 to 20 acres of vineyard and a little winery here and there. And I think, one of the people that really inspired me back then, and still does to this day, is kind of Walter Scott. And, to think that he was kind of in the early phases of his venture back then. But, now you look around and I see so many people that are making great wine, doing it without their own vineyards, without their own winery. I think the diversity of wine being made in Oregon now is really exciting. I think as much as I love Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, people that are out there pursuing Gamay and Trousseau and Chenin Blanc and Aligote, I think that's really endlessly fascinating, and I'm glad there's more diverse wines being made by a more diverse group of people making them, and I think it's really cool to me to see, people my age or younger going out there and doing it. I think it's, probably isn't as easy to do it now as it was 5 years ago, but I think the quality of wines coming out of Oregon have only increased, drastically in the last, 10 years since I've been here.
And so what do you see next for the industry?
I think that, the industry will continue to grow, but what I really see is it's, not a generational shift, but I think a lot of the kind of early pioneers, and I'm not talking about like the Adelsheims or the Lett or something like that, but I think there's a lot of people that, planted vineyards in the late 90s, early 2000s that are suddenly realizing that it's a lot of work and you really don't make it a lot of money. And I think there's going to, probably be a pretty decent turnover. And I think the kind of second, generation of people coming in will be very interesting. It never ceases to amaze me how many kind of wineries or labels pop up year to year without, really, where did you come from? Or so I think that'll be big, and you can see the outside investment coming. Whether it's people from California, people from Burgundy. I think that's going to continue to increase, and I think it'll be good. I think it's easy for us in Oregon to kind of sit back and rest on our laurels, but man, I tell you, if you go to a wine shop outside of Oregon, the shelf of Oregon wine is maybe 1/10 of what is available from California, and I certainly have high hopes for Oregon Chardonnay, but you go out there and there's still a lot of work to do. I think some people connotate Oregon and Pinot Noir, but far less know about Chardonnay or have even tried it. So I think there's still a pretty large gap to fill in getting our story out there. And I think that a lot of these ventures of St. Michel coming in, Constellation coming in, Kendall Jackson coming in, I honestly think it'll help the Oregon industry a lot. And I think it'll get quality wine in front of people at a good price point. And I think that's what it takes to get people kind of hooked. So.
And what comes next for you?
Oh, I don't know. I spent my last 3 or 4 years figuring out this last year. So what comes next for me? I don't know. I'm pretty contented as it is right now. My wife and I had a baby last year, so we got a 1-year-old at home. So, hopefully taking more time with him. The idea of both of us working harvest with children is significantly harder than I thought it was. Really kind of, I probably took that last harvest without a child for granted a little bit too much, but in some ways it's easier. I leave from work and, baby goes to the nanny and I come home from work and baby's sleeping, and it's kind of weird. It's almost like taking a break from being a parent, and, not in a good way. But yeah, I don't know what's next. I'm not crazy enough yet to want to start my own label or plant my own vineyard. I think I know too much and don't have enough money yet, to be honest. So,
is there anything sort of aspirational for you? Do you have goals or projects you'd like to do down the road?
Eventually, yeah, I'd like to make my way back to Tasmania at some point and make a little wine down there. I think that'd be nice. But other than that, goals and aspirations, just to continue to learn more, improve, and just get a couple good harvests under my belt at 00 and really kind of take that project to the next level and see where we go from there.
Obviously, someone who, in your position, you've interacted with a lot of interns. You've been an intern. You've interacted with lots of people getting into the industry. Tell me about best advice or words of wisdom for someone getting into the Oregon wine industry.
Oh, get a good pair of work boots. I think attitude is everything. I think, realizing that it's going to be harder than any other job, but more fun than any other job you've had. I think that's really important. I think, asking questions at the right time is really important. And I think, just having a good attitude is something that's irreplaceable as far as, anyone working in a winery, really. Like I said, at the end of the day, we're just making an expensive beverage. But I think that, if you show up and really work hard, stay off your phone. Kids these days, I'm an old man now, apparently. Work hard, be pleasant, ask the right questions at the right time. I think that gets you a long ways.
So the questions that I have for you, is there anything I didn't ask that I should have? Anything that we didn't cover that you'd like to cover today?
No, I don't think so.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your time, sharing your stories with us, sharing your wisdom with us as well.
Oh, yeah.
And we'll go ahead and let you off the hook.
Awesome, thank you.
Thank you.